Hey everybody, I'm Tyson Moore from Tyson Moore Builds, and I'm partnering with ToolsToday.com to show you how I built this hinged clamp rack for all of my Bessie clamps. Let's get started. First, I started with a standard 5.5 inch wide oak board and marked my first mark at 18 inches long. I brought the piece over to my miter saw and began cross-cutting the oak boards into various lengths. 3 at 18 inches, 1 at 22 inches, 1 at 14 inches, and 1 at 6 inches. Now on my miter saw, I am using Amana Tools Mamba 82 thin kerf blade, and as you can see, all of my crosscuts came out extremely smooth. Now, as I just mentioned, I cut the oak to the dimensions you see on the screen, but let me just pause to say that in hindsight, I should have cut mine 1 to 2 inches shorter, which would have allowed the Bessie 12-inch clamps to reach all the way to the bottom on my second shelf. As you see here, they didn't quite make it. So if you have a lot of 12-inch clamps, perhaps reduce the lengths to something more like these dimensions. Just be sure to keep the ratios the same. Next, I inserted my Amana Tools Prestige Electro-Blu 40-tooth general purpose blade into my table saw and began to prepare to rip each of my boards in half. Keeping in mind the full kerf of the blade, I carefully measured and adjusted my fence to right at 2 3/4 inches and made sure that each board would be ripped exactly in half. Once this was determined, I simply began ripping all of my boards in half. Now this left me with 6 pieces at 18 inches long, 2 at 22 inches, 2 at 14 inches, and 2 at 6 inches. Next, I took the 16.5 inch distance between where the vertical support pieces would be and divided it into 10 marks every 1.5 inches. I clamped all the 18 inch long boards together and made sure my piece with the pencil mark was at the front. Now at this point, I changed out my table saw blade for my Amana Tools Prestige Superfine Dado stack. I used the inner and outer 1/8 inch chippers with a 1/16 inch chipper in between. Definitely check the thickness of the bars on your clamps to determine how wide your dados need to be, since all clamp bars are not the same width. In hindsight, I could have just used the inner and outer chippers for a 1/4 inch dado. I used a piece of scrap to determine I wanted my dados to be cut at 1 3/4 inch deep to hold the clamps. So I raised my dado stack to that height, adjusted my fence to my first pencil mark, grabbed my cross-cut miter gauge, and cut my first dado. Now after a quick double check, I then moved on to centering my dado cut on every pencil mark I had made earlier. This left me with 10 equally spaced dados. I will say that adding a sacrificial scrap piece of wood as your last piece in the stack will help a lot with tear out. I then laid out all of my pieces to get my first glimpse of what this clamp rack would look like. And with all of my pieces ripped and cut to where they needed to be, I was ready to move on. Next, I pulled out my Amana Tools 3/8 inch Countersink bit with depth stop and adjusted both the depth stop and the drill bit to ensure my screws would sit exactly where I wanted them. I then measured and marked 2 spots on the ends of each 18 inch dado board, threw my bit into the drill, and prepared to drill all of my holes. Now I decided to attach my unit with screws, primarily because I wanted to try plugging the screw holes, as you will later see. However, you can attach these together using box joints or cut yourself a nice set of dovetails. Either way, you can tell that this drill bit makes quick, clean work of drilling countersunk holes. Now as a side note, it is important to remember to drill the holes on opposite sides of each set so that the dado grooves stay in their original alignment. Once this is done, it's a simple process of attaching everything together with a bit of glue and screws. Next, I grabbed a piece of scrap walnut and prepared to cut out some plugs for the countersunk holes I just drilled. I made a quick jig to help keep the bits in line. I'm using my 3/8 inch Timberline straight wood plug cutter and plan to use the jig to cut 2 plugs right next to each other and then shift it down to cut more. I was in need of 24 plugs. Now if you have a drill press, then this will be even easier as you won't need a jig to help keep things aligned or to keep the bit from skipping around. But as you'll see here, a simple jig works just as fine. If a hand drill is all that you own, this is perfect. Next, I used a little nail set to break the plugs loose. I was pleasantly surprised with how easy this part of the process was. In hindsight, I definitely drilled these plugs deeper than I needed and could have gotten away with a shallower plug, but as you'll soon see, it doesn't matter as that they will all be flush cut anyways. I then filled up one of my holes with glue and dipped and then inserted the plugs into all the holes. Having a mallet or something to knock them in is helpful, and if you don't have a mallet, I can definitely help you out with that. Now after the glue dried, I flush cut all of my plugs. As you can see, I discovered my multi-tool was way faster at cutting these off than my flush cut saw, but it may just be that I'm really bad at using my handsaw. Anyways, I cut all of them flush and then sanded them down. Next, I pulled out my Amana Tools 1/4 inch roundover router bit because I wanted to round over the edges on the top of each shelf. I love the fact that Amana has included a little K-shaped mark on all of their router bits to help me quickly see where to correctly place it in the router. Again, I wanted to round over the tops to give it a softer look and add just a tiny bit of extra detail. Now with my multi-purpose blade back in the table saw, I rotated the blade to 45 degrees and began working on the French cleat that I will use to hang this unit on the wall. I did this by simply ripping another 18-inch piece of oak at 45 degrees and marking where I wanted it to be. I then put my dado stack back in the table saw and cut a little section on each vertical rail where the French cleat would sit. Now I measured this to where the piece would sit flush with a half lap joint and used my jigsaw to cut away a piece of the angle. I then popped it into place to make sure everything was going to fit and then went back to the table saw and used my dado stack to create a half lap joint on each of the edges. I then glued and screwed the back piece in for a nice flush fit. And once the unit is on the wall, it will fit together just like this. Next up was drilling a couple holes in each rail and inserting 1/4 inch dowels to provide a little extra support and alignment to the entire unit. This was a good idea that my IG friend John the Woodworker suggested. I then moved on to finishing the oak with some teak oil that I had in the shop. You can also paint yours instead if you prefer. I actually did that when I built my first hinge clamp rack, which you can see hanging on the wall behind me. But I went with this teak oil because I wanted to bring out the grain and emphasize these walnut plugs. Once everything dried, I cut and installed a continuous hinge on the sides of each section. I cut mine with a metal jigsaw blade, but you could use a simple hacksaw. The final step was simply to find a stud and attach the other 45-degree oak piece to the wall. Once this was attached, it was a simple lift and hang. Seriously, look, it's just that easy. This is why I love the French cleat. And because I recessed mine into the unit, the vertical rails sit flush with the wall. Each section hinges out and worked just as I hoped it would. The only thing left was to fill it up with clamps. Now I will pause here to remind you that at the beginning of the video I mentioned to double check your clamp bar lengths when determining your measurements. Reducing the ratios just by an inch or two would have allowed for my 12-inch clamps to hang all the way through. But regardless, the clamps still stay in place for me. It's only a matter of preference. And that's it. The hinge clamp rack is finished and it works great. Thanks again for watching this video. I hope it inspires you to build your own clamp rack. To see more space-saving projects like this one, you can visit my website at tysonmoorebuilds.com or view process pictures and videos on Instagram at Tyson_more. If you have any questions or comments, just leave them below and I'll be happy to answer them. Thanks again for watching, and a huge thanks to ToolsToday.com for sponsoring this video.